Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of the Low Code Cafe, episode 105. The main topic for today are triggers, being trigger happy with Plant an App, and we'll see the main categories of triggers that come with Plant an App, but also highlighting how you can create your own types of triggers to extend the platform. But before that, let me briefly introduce myself and this event. So my name is Bogdan Litescu. I'm the founder and CEO of Plant an App, and this is a event that we are doing every week, every Wednesday at the same hour. It's a community event. It's a learning event. We always come up with new topics. Sometimes we also have guest speakers from the community to showcase what they are building. Speaking of which, if you have any cool stories to tell, we'd love to have you present in this webinar. As you've noticed, this event is being recorded, which means 104 hours of very good training content on our YouTube channel, with topics varying from building applications to more advanced pro coding to some customer use cases. So very, very interesting content. Make sure to subscribe as we are pushing new content every week. Good. So let's get down to business. The agenda for today, we'll hear the stories from the trenches, from Dale, our head of support, and hear the hotfixes that are coming out. And afterwards, we'll get into the main topic of today, which is the triggers, where Dale will show us all the possibilities, and I will cover a bit of the custom part, creating custom triggers. So enjoy the content, and Dale, I will let you pick it up from here.
Very good. Thank you, Bogdan. We are releasing 6 new hotfixes this week to version 1.21. They are all in the form of bug fixes, and I'll just run through them here real quickly. In automation, after you upgraded to version 1.21, we had some clients that were that needed to do an app pool reset in order to to activate their site, and we have eliminated that issue. Also, if you went into automation history, trying to see the history of scheduled jobs that were running, it was throwing an error, and that's fixed. In our form, there was some usage of date and time could trigger an infinite loop, and that's been resolved. With our agreement links, we had a problem being able to add content on that particular type of field. So if you're using that fix is out there for you to use. This is a very isolated use case, but we have a touch signature, the ability to create a signature and upload it, to collect a signature and upload it. And if you were requiring that, the required field worked, but if you were conditionally requiring it, that didn't. And so now that's fixed. That was actually for a particular customer use case, probably uncommon. And then this is one that it would be hard to notice, but this is a very useful one to upload the app builder. Internally, we build some URLs that we use when we want to get to certain pages, and those weren't building properly. So again, this would be a very good hotfix to pull in. And beyond that, I wanted to talk about load user scope. In our low-code Campfire meeting last Friday, we had some questions about load user, and it's kind of interesting how load user works. So just to kind of give a context, sometimes you need to act as if you were a user. But so, for example, if you wanted to send out an email as if you were a user, or to create records in Plant an App, or update records as if you were a user, let's say the condition was that you were doing you have an application that has a form that's presented to users that aren't logged in on your site, and you need to create records within Plant an App entity. In order to do that, you have to have be elevated to a user that has the rights to do that. And so load user is the action that gets you there. You can specify the user that you want to act on behalf of, and in that set of actions, that's going to last for a while. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, the scope of how long that lasts. Did some experimentation just to make sure that I understood it before I presented it to you. And what it turns out that if you have a set of actions and you do load user, that lasts until that set of actions is complete. At the end of the action stack, then you go back to being the user as you were logged in. I'm going to show these in practically, but I'm going to cover them first here. If you use execute actions, the action that lets you put actions underneath the execute actions, and you do a load user, the load user lasts until that execute actions is complete. Once it pops up to the next action, then you're back to being the original user. So that's an interesting and a little surprising example that I didn't realize was in there. And then if you do it inside a workflow, that only lasts as long as the workflow lasts. When you come out of the workflow, then you return to the user as you were. So if we take a look at that, let me show you a form. And again, this is not a particularly pretty form. It's just to illustrate the point. So if we take a look at this, I have a button that's called load user in an execute actions. And so what we do is we have this execute actions action, and inside of it, we do a load user. And so we pick out a different user identifier that we're going to load to. And when we do that, then the next statement, for example, this toast message can set that is inside the execute action says the user ID is whatever. So Campfire 7A, the one I've selected here, is also user 30 on my system. And so it's just elevating it to user 30. Well, when you come outside, when that lasts only as long as this execute actions last, because when you come out, it tells you what your user ID, and it's this is actually the same as when you started. So this shows the scope of this of that load user is limited to that execute actions. So just again, to illustrate that point, I have a button, show my user ID. My user ID is 1. You can see it here. If I click load user and execute actions, during that one execute actions, this is the toast we were just looking at, it's 30, but as soon as it gets outside, it goes back to 1. So it only lasts that long. I'll cover these other two cases quickly because I think it's useful to have documented. So load user above an execute actions, we have a load user that happens right at the top. It's not inside of an execute actions. And so when if we have a toast that's inside execute actions, we'll see that it's going to show that 30 that happens because we're loading Campfire 7B as the user. But outside of execute actions, it's going to remain that 30 as well. And so let's take a look at that one. So load user above execute actions, it's 30 inside, it's 30 outside. It remains that way right up until you end that set of actions. And then if I go back and click show my user ID, see, it doesn't elevate me permanently. It only lasts inside that stack. And then I'm not going to show this one off, but it's essentially I have a workflow that does a load user, and it just illustrates that while it's inside that workflow, it remains at the elevated at the different user, but as soon as it comes out of the workflow, it reverts. So if you're using load user it's useful to understand what the scope is, how long it lasts, and hopefully that little bit of documentation is useful to you. Moving on, I would invite you to engage in Campfire. This is where that question originally came up, and that's our more interactive segment that happens this same hour on Fridays. So sign up for the Low Code Campfire. Here's some links, and I'm going to put these on the chat that might be useful to you if you want to register in advance to come to Low Code Campfire, if you want to see our recordings, work with us on the community portal, or give feedback on this event. All those links are included here. Okay, on to the topic of the day, trigger happy. So the focus for all of today is going to be about automations. And so what are automations? They have settings, they have triggers, they have actions, they have on error. And so just for those of you who might who need to know, automation is located here on the Plant and App menu. And when you get there, you have a list of jobs. So automations are things that run automatically for you at the appropriate time, and can also be triggered individually. You can start them when you want, but it's just bits of code that are going to run at the appropriate time, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What's the appropriate time? We have a variety of triggers that can get these things started, and then once they start, they act on your behalf. So if we were to do a new job, they have 4 sections: the settings, which are things like the job name and whether they're in debug mode. The triggers define when these things get started. So we're going to spend all our time in here just as soon as we get a core job set up. The actions are what happens when a trigger is raised. And then finally, on error. If something goes wrong in your actions and it raises an error, you can add actions in this section that will execute and let you get a hold of the error. And I'll just point out that this hover shows you exactly what kinds of things are available to you. So, for example, the action name and the description and the error message and stack trace, all the different things that might be of interest on an error. This tells you what's available to you, so you can log them or email them or whatever you need to do. Okay, so we're going to create, I'm going to bounce back and forth here. We are going to focus on triggers, but we're going to start by setting up a job that's just going to demonstrate that automation works and what you get out of debug mode. So we've got a new job, and this is going to be Low Code Café 105 triggers. Doesn't matter what we call it, but we give it a name. It's going to operate in the context of our portal. This defaults to the right portal. You don't usually have to select something here. And if you needed it to act as if it were a particular user, this is you could put a user ID or a number here, and it would act. Anything that took it's the equivalent of doing a load user that we were just talking about. It will allow you to act as if you were a different user. But I am going to turn on debug mode because we're going to see what information we're going to get, extra information in the job history. Typically, you wouldn't leave it in debug mode once you get it going and developed, but this will provide some extra information to us. We're not going to define any triggers. That's going to be our focus here once we get our job started. But in our actions, I am going to create a token. This token or variable is going to have our job name. So we'll create a job name token and give it the value of LCC 105 triggers. And then we are going to, as our next action, we are going to log to an event. This will go to our event log and it will be visible to us. And so the properties that we're going to add to this is just, we're going to send out our job name into the log. And so we'll do this. So just two very simple actions that we're going to do, and then we will save it. So now we have our job, LCC 105 triggers. If you click in on it, you'll see that you have the ability to run it now. Let's go over what else is there. When is it going to run? There are no active triggers, so it's not going to run automatically. It's never been run, and there aren't any triggers, but there are two actions. So a little bit of summary about what's going on. I'm going to click run now and get it to run. And now we see that the last run was today at 10:16 a.m. and it was successful, meaning no errors. We can look in the, we can see two evidences that this ran. One is that we look in the history, we have a history entity, we can click in on it, open it up, and we get a little bit of information. One of the things that we get out of it is the final state of all the context variables. So the fact that we created a job name variable, we can see that its final state had the value of LCC 105 triggers. So that can be useful from a debugging standpoint. You can see what your variables were. Because jobs run in the background and you can't see them, this is one way to tell what the job was doing. You can create context tokens, and then you can see their values when it ends. The other thing that we can do is we can look in the logs, and I'm just going to open this up in a new window. Because we did the admin alert, we can see that we have our job name and it shows LCC 105 triggers. So the job, this is just proving the job ran, right? So whatever we want to send to the auto log, we can. So we've created a job and it runs if you click the button, but now we're going to start to dig in and see, well, what do we get if we do triggers? So we'll edit the job and start assigning triggers. First of all, there are 4 different types. There are things that happen at the app level. There are things that happen at the database level, the things that are related to time, and things that are related to users. And we're going to touch all of them if we have time today. But the first one we're going to do a very simple one that is a one-time trigger. You want to set up something to happen. You set up a job and you want it to happen once. You want it to happen at a very particular date and time, and so you can set it. One of the main things to look at is that this is always specified in UTC time. So you need to be thinking in terms of what your UTC time is. You can look, my offset I know is 5 hours. So we'll be doing an example today. I'm going to actually set this up to run at, since my offset is 5 hours, it's actually 3 in the afternoon is when I need to set this up to run. So I'm going to set this up to run at 3:20 p.m. And if I'm 3:20 p.m. And so by creating this and saving it, we can now open this up and take a look. It's going to run, it says the next run is, it's translated it now to my current time zone. So 10:20, when this hits 10:20, it's actually going to run. And we can actually see that it's, the last run has now changed to 10:20. It ran very quickly in 0.03 of a second, and it has no next run scheduled. That's what a one-time trigger does. You can specify a time and you can see it. Now, again, getting back into proof, did it really run? We can look at the history, see we've got another thing that happened exactly at 10:20. And as we look at the information that we get there, it's kind of interesting because now we get a trigger type. We can see that the trigger type that ran was called one time, and the current action is number 52. So this is, again, information that you get because we have debugging turned on. And so if we go back to our job and edit, we're going to be going back and forth a lot today. We can see, for example, that the last action was number 52. So it's telling you that current actions, which was the last one that was running when we were debugging. But we could add as part of our output this trigger type. That's going to be the name of it, but we're also going to pass the value of it into our log event. And so if we wanted our log to represent to include that information, we could include it. Now, again, since it's set up as a one-time trigger, we're going to do a little bit of time math here. We want it to be today and at 22 after the hour. So we'll just set this up to 22 and save. And so when we roll around to 10:22 on the clock, this thing should run. So we got a next run time set here, and we can wait a second, and there it goes. So it runs, and it's one time it sets up no next run. And now we can demonstrate if we look in the log, we have another admin alert. And so we can see now we've got the job name and the trigger type of one time. So good information, getting it to run. And so we've explored the first type of trigger, first type of time trigger, or one-time trigger. Keeping track of where we are, we've done the one-time trigger. Now we'll go on and talk about the repeat daily. So this is this is something that runs and then gets scheduled again for the next day. So if we edit our trigger, we'll delete out this one and add a different time trigger, the repeat daily one. We can set it up to run at a particular time. Again, UTC time. So we have to adjust this for our current. Let's say that we'll do this at 10. Excuse me. I remember my offset here, 3:25 p.m. And we want it to run Monday through Friday, so we can set that and save. And so if we were now to look ahead, it says this thing last ran, and we can see that it ran at 10:22. That's because of our other trigger, but now it's set up to run at 10:25 UTC. And it's set up for today. So that would run if we let it go. We're not. I'm going to adjust it a little bit and say that I really only want to run on Saturdays. So still keeping this same time, but Saturdays. So now if we look at the trigger, we can see that its next run is set for the 20th at 10:25 local time here. And so that then after it ran, it would advance and it would show that the next would run once a week. So this is a good trigger if you have something that you want to run one time a day at a specific time, and you can pick the days, or you can pick all of the days. So you can run every day or just Tuesdays or whatever you like. So that's a pretty straightforward trigger. Let's look at another one. If we, sticking in the time, there is repeat on interval. So the repeat on interval runs, and then it's scheduled again for that same interval again. So we could, if we wanted to do something every 15 seconds, we could say 15 seconds, minutes, hours, days. So we could say that we want this every 15 seconds, and it's going to run. So we save this. Take a look at it again, and now we see it's scheduled for 10:25 at 15 seconds, and then it ran at that time, and now it's scheduled for 30. So it'll just keep going on and on every 15 seconds. So this would be a good trigger to use if you want to do something twice a day. You could set it up for every 12 hours, starting at a particular time. You can, again, looking at the parameters for this, you can specify how many seconds, minutes, hours, or days. So every 3 days you could run something. So it gives you it automatically it runs, and then it schedules the next one to go. So let's go on to this last time trigger, this cron advanced. And this is this part where if you need something that isn't covered by any of the others, you can dig in and learn about cron and do it. So for example, this one, this very specific one, expression, gives you every 5 minutes in the 10 a.m. Central Time during the 10 o'clock hour. But so this would be, it would run 12 times in the every 5 minutes in the 10 o'clock hour, and then quit, and then wait until the next day. So that's kind of a cool thing to be able to express that far more advanced. So let's put that one in. This is the Cron Trigger Advanced. It needs an expression. We put that expression in, and I'll show you these expressions. We'll link out to this expression syntax. Actually, we'll do that. So we'll dig into that in just a second. But I'm going to save this and see. Again, we can see when it's scheduled to run. This one is scheduled to run now at 10:30 today, and that's because it's every five minutes. So we're at 10:27. It's just set up to run in the future. So let's see the kinds of things that you can do. This this link that's again comes out of our documentation and points to this course scheduler. Shows that you can specify seconds, minutes, hours, a day of the month, particular month, day of the week. So lots of special values, and it tells you how to do this. But then down at the bottom here, it has a bunch of handy examples. So you could fire this trigger at 10:15, the last day of the month, or the second to the last day of the month. So if you had a very specific business case where you're trying to do something at the beginning of the month or the end of the month, or on the last Friday of the month, first Monday of the month, it gives you the ability to set that up and let it run. So very handy, a little bit more cryptic syntax, but it's the cron syntax. So take a look at that. You need one of those extended methods. Okay, so that's gotten us through the ones that are based on time. Run it once, every day, every period of time, or some very advanced expression. Let's take a look at app events. So there's several different of these, and they fall into a number of categories. The first one is when the app starts or ends. So the DNN platform can go to sleep or be restarted. And so when that happens, you can either schedule something to happen every time it gets started up, or every time it's going to go to sleep. And so this app start, app end covers that possibility. And so we'll look at those. There's also when it's idle. If the CPU is quiet, you want it to do stuff. So this would be a great to define something that's lazy, only happening when your site is not busy. You can define one for when an error occurs, and then you can define one every time somebody does a request on your website. It's a pretty specialized case, but if you need it, you can do it. So let's work through a couple of these. So first, we'll edit our same job that we've been doing and disable this cron trigger. Actually, before we do that, I've talked through now this cron trigger, and so we see it actually last ran on 10:30 as it promised, and then it goes on to 10:35. So that cron trigger is working. Okay, so we'll delete that one out and add a new one. We're on app events, and we're going to do it based on app start. So in fact, it fires once after an application start or restart. And so if we were to save this now and take a look at it, you'll see that it's not scheduled to run at all. It has a trigger, but it's not scheduled because it's not based on time. If we were to come over and force a restart, we can restart the application. And when we do that, then once the application does a restart, this should run. And I don't know if you saw it, we can find it here. But if we take a look at it now, we can see it ran at 10:31:02. It's when the thing happened to restart. And so every time that the app restarts or starts up first place, it does something. So this would be the kind of thing that would be good if you wanted to, for example, force a token to have a value, assuming you have a globally cached token. You could, when the app starts up, you give the token its value, and then anytime it gets used from that point forward, it would come from cache and be very, very fast. Yeah, if we look at logs here, we can see that this thing, it actually did run when the app restarted. We can, and yet we, in some cases, the trigger type doesn't actually get a value. Looking into whether or not we can make that happen. It should have said that it's an app restart or an app start was the trigger that triggered that. Patrick, take a note. Okay. So that was app start, and app. I'm going to delete that one out and move on. That was app start. You could do it app end as well. I'm going to move on to talking about app idle because it has these additional parameters that would be useful to understand. And I hadn't been working with the product for about 7 years, and I hadn't ever used this one. But again, this is a great case when you want something to happen lazily in the background. For example, if you need to send out some emails, but you don't want to do that when your server is really, really busy, you could do it this way. So, for example, you could say that you only want this to do it when the CPU is less than 10%. You want to send out, let's say, every 5 seconds, you want it to send out a new email. So that would be, 12 a minute. But you really don't want it to be sending anything out if the CPU is busier than that. So you could say that every 300 seconds, it'll do one. Every 5 minutes, you'll send out one email if the CPU is busy, but it'll do one every 5 seconds if it's not busy. So that's a nice way to be able to express that. If we save it and take a look, we can see whether or not our CPU meets the threshold. So one went out at 10:34, and then again, it should happen every 5 seconds if the CPU is quiet. I don't have any way of knowing when the CPU is quiet at this point, but we're seeing it's not happening. Right? It would happen every 5 minutes. 300 seconds would expire. Let's make a change to this to just kind of prove the point that it is working. We'll bring the CPU threshold much higher, so it'll basically force it to run based on the time schedule. So it should go out every 5 seconds now because CPU is under 50%. So I think pretty useful functionality if you wanted to find something that's lazy. Cool. So again, you can do it on app error, and then let's do, begin request, end request. So every time somebody hits your website, just the act of browsing to your site would trigger a request, trigger a job to run. So if you have something that needs to check, I don't really quite know what a good use case for this is, but if you wanted to monitor the site overall, and every time somebody's doing something, maybe you're just measuring hits, I don't know, but that would be a way to do that. It would be a very intensive one, so you want to use that one sparingly for just the right case. So with that, we can move on to database triggers. These are fun. I guess if you're a little nerd-like and you consider database fun. So this is every time you do something in the database, you can trigger a job to run. So for example, every time you get a new customer, you can do something. Or every time your customer changes or if somebody deletes a customer, maybe you want to make a record of that. So we can work with these. Let's take a look at our site. I'm going to find, actually, I'm going to do this a different way. Take a look at our entities, and I have some customers here, some contacts rather. So I'm going to go take a look at our contacts page. And so we have these customers here that are listed, and this is in our customer, or rather our contact entity. And one of the properties is name. So let's say that we want to do something every time we get a new contact. Well, we can change our, we'll get rid of our test job here. We'll get rid of this app idle trigger, and instead we'll be into database. So every time there's an inserted customer, rather contact, we just pick what table we want to watch. So we want to watch app contact, and it's going to create a trigger that fires when something is inserted into the table. And it also tells you that you automatically get column names as part of that. So, for example, name is going to be available to us as a token. And so in our logging here, we can say new contact name. Just whatever we want to put into the log. But the idea here is now this trigger is going to run when we have a new contact, and it's going to put them into the log. You could do anything. You could send a welcome email or whatever it is that you like. So if I add one, and this is going to be add Mr. Pratt here to the to my contacts. If I now go and take a look at the logs, we'll get an added administrative alert, and it says that new contact Tom Pratt was added. So now every time we get an insert, we get an activity on our job. We can see that it was last run, 10:38. So we can tell that it was run. And then interestingly, if we look at their history, because we have debugging on, we get to see everything. So we can see that the name value, I didn't provide any rating or city. We could have, but we can see the on-DB trigger worked. And then we also get this thing called row JSON data. So it's showing you all the values. It's giving you all the values that you could use that to work with JSON if you wanted to get all the values that came from this new inserted record. So lots and lots of stuff, and that history, that debug mode is helping reveal what's available to you to use. Okay, so that is the first of our triggers on database insert. Let's say different use case. We want to know every time somebody makes a change to a customer. So we can look at our database and say on database update. And this is, we're still going to point to the contact table, but this is going to be every time you update a table, and you're going to get values like column name before. So what was the name before the change, and what was the name after the change? And so you'll be able to use that in your job. You can see what the changes were, or if there were changes. So in our case, we can say that the contact name was changed to name. And actually what we need to do is say before. So we're going to use the before token and the after token to say that something happened. So we'll save that for a database and make a change. I'm going to change a couple of things here. Well, I'm going to change his name to Thomas, and we now go and look at the logs and look at our most recent event. We get an alert that says contact Tom Pratt was changed to Thomas Pratt. So we get an output there. If we go back and edit this again. We're doing an update and provide a city name, but didn't change the name. We're going to see that if we were to look in the logs, we're going to still get our output, but it's not going to make a lot of sense because it says contact Thomas Pratt was changed to Thomas Pratt. We're watching the whole record, and any change to the record, whether it's the name or not, is going to trigger that job to run. And so we didn't, our logging only captured the name, and really anything could have changed. We look in on the history, you can see that we have these before values and after values. So you can see the name before that and the name after, and it didn't change. But if you look at the city, the end city was Duncanville, but the city before, if I find it, was blank. So we really had a change of city, not name, and we logged it as a change of name. So that's a little logic error or illustration that this update trigger works on the whole row. Any change on any property in the table is going to trigger this to run. But there's an answer for that. Before I go on to the answer, I wanted to point out, you got to be careful when you're using database triggers not to set up some infinite recursion. You can crash your server this way. So if you were to, we're doing an update query. If our action was to do an update on the contact table, then after this fires one time, it's going to fire again. And every time it fires, it creates a new update. So it's going to keep firing and firing and firing. It'll go on forever. So this warning is very important to read and think about. Don't set up something that's going to infinitely cause your trigger to run. So we're going to not do a database update, but instead we're going to use this other variety, the update column. So update column, we're going to pay attention to the same one, but now we're just going to pay attention to the name column. So if you change a city, it doesn't care. You can use commas or semicolons to list out a lot of them that you want to change. We're just going to watch name. So now if we go in here and change the city from one thing to another, we're going to find that the trigger doesn't run at all because it's not watching the city column. And so if we look at this, we can see, wanted logs, sorry. We didn't get any change on that one to pay attention to, but if we go in and change the name, then it will fire. And so now we look at the logs and see that the name was changed. So it's a way to watch one or more columns. And again, that same rule applies. You don't want it to something that's changing the name to also change the name again, because it will fire forever. Okay, with that, I am going to fast forward through the remainder of the triggers just so that you know that they're there. But I hope I've inspired you to look in on other triggers. And then we'll go to part two. Bogdan is going to jump in here in a second. So we covered on our database triggers, we covered all of the ones. We covered insert, update of a column, and delete is all the same. It's the same idea that when you can capture the delete of something and you get the value before it's deleted. So if after something gets deleted, you could write something in the log, for example, to say that contact XYZ was deleted, or you could send a final email, your contact information has been deleted from our system, that kind of thing. So it gives you lots and lots of options. I'm going to remove these, and then we can just talk about the last type, which is the user. So there's the ability to capture when a user got created, when they logged into the system, when they if they were to come in through an auto login, those events are all captured, and you'll see that it tells you can use the user colon, so user ID, user name, all the various tokens that are available to you to do something with, for example, when a user logs on. So we've covered database. We've talked about user login, auto login created. And so now we go on to the two other types. If you were to install our email sync add-on, you would get the ability to check to do something every time a new mail comes in through IMAP. So sometimes adding on and to installing an add-on will give you more trigger types. Trigger types can be defined, and this is where I'm going to ask Bogdan to jump in and show off. There's an architecture that lets you to do this, to add custom trigger types. And so today he's going to show you the architecture, and then we're going to talk about some different kinds of triggers that we could build. And I think next week we'll take on building one of them. So we'll touch on that at the very end. So I'm going to stop and let you jump in and
sure. Thanks.
Show off this architecture.
Sure. I will share my screen. So as many things inside Plantain App, we have many interfaces where professional developers can extend the platform. So one such example, you see my screen all right? The one with the automation. Yeah. So we've already covered through a couple of videos how you can create new actions, new fields in the form. So same applies with triggers. So I already did a simple example here. It's not working, but just to illustrate the purpose. So for example, I created a new trigger type where I want to observe the file system. So every time a file change, my automation fires, so I can do something with that file. Maybe send an email notification, or maybe do some processing on the file. Like, for example, creating thumbnails for images that are uploaded in a folder. Okay. So this new type of triggers that you create will have various parameters, as you've seen, and then of course behind the scenes you have the code that executes, connects this job and then executes the actions. Good. So just showing you a bit on the architecture. So this is let's say a topic for professional developers. So the architecture is quite simple. We have an interface that defines the trigger type, and that interface is responsible of running a trigger. So when Dale showed us earlier that, for example, he was doing the application events, right? So the application events is we call it a service or a trigger type, that implements this interface. So potentially, professional developers could implement their own interfaces to define a new behavior when a job triggers, right? And here, for example, are all the services that are built-in automation. So you've seen app events, you've seen database triggers, you've seen the time events, you've seen the user events. So for each class of triggers, types of triggers, there is a service that knows what to do with them. So there's a very simple architecture, and I will show you also the configuration files. Let me this other screen. Good. So behind the scenes, let me bring this. Behind the scenes, same as with most of our extension points, that are driven from configuration files, right? So here I'm in the config folder. In the config folder that lives on disk, so it's desktop module. So there's a path where you find config files. So same would be for actions. and other types. So in this folder, you have everything that can, through configuration, can extend the platform. So actions, for example, are here. So actions specific to just to the automation are in this folder, and other stuff. Today we look at the trigger services and triggers. So let's start with the let's see, triggers. Let's start with the triggers, because here I've already created an example. So let's look at the file system. This is the one that you've seen. So just by creating this configuration file, I got something new to appear in my list of available triggers. And what I did here, and maybe it's worth comparing it with, let's say, maybe not the app events is too simple. Let me find one that has parameters as well. So, for example, the database update that Dale showed. Make this JSON. So, for example, this is the configuration for database update. So it has an ID that uniquely identifies this trigger. Some help text, and then this is an important part, because here it links this trigger to the service that knows what to do with this trigger. So basically, this is on database update, but this service knows what to do with this configuration, right? And then the parameters that you've seen in the UI. In my example, with the file system, I created a parameter to select the folder from a list. So just by providing a couple of information here, I got to display a dropdown, and because I said the data source is the Porter folder list, it got populated automatically for me. So in itself, you can create triggers. Anything that you put in that configuration will just appear here. You want 10 parameters, you put 10 parameters, and things like that. What happens afterwards when the automation first runs, first loads the automation screen, the backend logic? It goes through all the triggers and calls that method that I showed you, this install method on every trigger. Now, what install means is different for every trigger type, right? So for let's see, for the app events, let's look at this. What does install do? So on install, it just collects them in a dictionary. So then it can, when it attaches to the ASP.NET events, so then when something happened, oh, sorry, this is the idle event. Oh, okay. The rest are, I think, should be somewhere around here. Yeah, like all these events, so this would be like a custom business logic that would be specific to each type. So basically, every time so you see, for example, with this app events module, we do an HTTP module, so we monitor all events. So when something happens, we fire the jobs that use the triggers. And each would be specific, like let's see another simple one, the user events. The user events, it will just register to the events from the platform. So whenever a user event happens, this trigger service knows that, oh, these are the jobs that I should fire because they use this trigger, right? So in my case, I think I started a new one, but I don't have anything in here. So now I'm creating a folder watch service, and the first time automation would run, we'll call this install method. And the trigger info is just the configuration that you see on the UI. Is this configuration here? The trigger info will tell me which folder was selected, for example, and what job is attached to. So then I will do my logic here to start a file watch on that folder, and when the system notifies me that a file has changed, in turn, I will look at this trigger, at this job ID, and say, okay, job, you now should execute with these parameters. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to start doing this. It's not a complicated architecture. Behind the scenes, we take care of wiring everything, so developers don't have to.
Very nice. So I've put out on the chat, and this is something that we'll continue discussing on in our Campfire this Friday, but a challenge for Bogdan. We could next week. He's going to try and take on one of these, actually completing one of these triggers. So we could do a file watch trigger. Another idea would be to do one that is watching a database and looking for a specific value, right? So if you're looking for the status to change from new to in progress, or a trigger to watch when a database update happens and the value of a column changes to the value of some other column. So those are a couple of challenges that or ideas that we've come up with. But if you have a trigger challenge that you'd like to suggest, we would love to hear from that. So you have a chance to vote on that today if you want to put it in the chat, or otherwise come to Campfire on Friday. We can talk about what kind of challenge we should put in front of Bogdan for next week. Good. Bogdan, anything else for today? Oh, we do have a question about the install entry points.
Yes, so the question is from Roberto. Do the install entry points fire every time the application starts? Yes, every time the application starts, this install is being called, and actually every time you update the trigger, right? Because you are creating a trigger, and at that stage, or you are updating a trigger, at that stage, the service needs to know, oh, there's a new trigger, I should install it, or there's an update to the trigger, I should see what is the schedule now. Maybe it runs under different conditions. So yes, every time the application starts or a trigger gets updated, this install method will be called to do the setup for the trigger.
And that is a great question. If you have one, or we have a couple of minutes to answer. But yeah, I can see this. I mean, again, kind of going back over it. This is I think we're calling it pro code kind of topic. That it's a place where somebody can make something very easy for a no coder or a low coder to use. So if there's something specific in your environment that you want to test for, it could be even an outside service, or watching the price of a stock, or really the imagination is the limit. But we can put those into place, and then a less experienced developer, or not a professional coder, could consume that. So you could have a stock watch trigger, and just say, okay, I want to watch the price of the stock, and do something when something happens. Really
yep.
Quite powerful.
Yeah. And what I forgot to show, probably the most important thing that wires everything. So this is letting plant and app know that there is a service with this ID that is called application events, and you saw this ID is matched with the trigger, and is this type implementation. So that's how plant and app knows at runtime. If you create a new trigger of type of file system that I created, it will know to call this class to initialize, to do the install and uninstall. So this is like the magic place where everything gets connected, the service configuration file.
And as you pointed out, that kind of matches up with the pattern that we see, for example, in installing new actions. Same kind of pattern. Very good.
Yeah. And the nice thing, I mean, we also went the extra mile to make this very, very simple, even for professional developers, because the implementation is straightforward. Just implement an interface, and all the code lives here, or other classes that you want to create. And the config file lives on disk, and that's it. Everything else, it's the developer's decision what to do.
I know we've had been part of a discussion with a professional coder that's outside of Plant and App that's looked at this and said, okay, this is cool. This is exactly how I would have designed it if I were designing a system. So, I say that as not a professional developer, not as a pro coder, that those that see it say, yep, I can work with this. Okay, with that, we've hit the top of our hour. I am going to, or you've got it, good. So thank you for attending today. This is a We look forward to seeing you next week when we complete this topic, but we get together once a week on this on Wednesdays and do a deep dive on something technical in our product every week. Very good. Thanks, and we'll see you then.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.